200 years ago, Singapore was a jungle, an obscure tropical island, barely inhabited. Today, it's an Asian tiger, an economic giant. This city-state has no natural resources. Its land is infertile. So why has it lured so many people from around the world, seeking their fortune? Today's Singapore has been shaped by one man, Lee Kuan Yew. He ruled the country for a quarter of a century, leading it into the modern age. But what was Singapore like before Lee Kuan Yew? How did it ever emerge onto the world stage?
Unless you know where you came from, unless you know what your ancestors have been through, you have no reference point. What makes us different from, say, the Thais, or the Filipinos, or the Sri Lankans? The difference is how we came here, how we developed, and that requires a sense of history.
Singapore's history can be traced back to the beginnings of the global economy and to the ambitions of a maverick British pioneer. He came from a very different world to Lee Kuan Yew, but has left his imprint just as clearly on the modern city. Without him, Singapore would never have begun its remarkable journey. From mangrove to metropolis. Singapore is a tiny island that's been shaped by the grand forces of history. Back in the 19th century, the British were developing a powerful trading empire and had their sights set on Southeast Asia. January 1819, a small expeditionary force has arrived on the island, working for the British East India Company. The leader is a highly ambitious, determined young man, an official of the company. His name would become forever linked with Singapore. He is Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles.
He was a man with a vision, ahead of his time perhaps, whereas most of the East India Company officials in this part of the world were basically here for the trade, perhaps for the adventure. Raffles had an idea of changing the world, of making it a better place.
Raffles was fascinated by Singapore's history and carried out an archaeological survey of the island, looking for evidence of its glorious 14th century past. Back then, Singapore was an important island at the center of a thriving Malay kingdom. It was known as Temasek and appears on the earliest Chinese maps of the region.
Raffles realized that there had been a former state here, a former kingdom, and in many respects he wanted to create a new Temasek, a new Singapore that would be guided by the British.
But Raffles had no legal right to do anything on this Malay island without the blessing of a Malay sultan. The local Sultan of Johor had already ruled out making any deals with the British, but he had a disgruntled elder brother, Hussein, with a rival claim to his throne. Raffles realized this and smuggled Hussein into Singapore, Without any authority, he proclaimed him to be the rightful sultan. In effect, Raffles had carried out a coup.
This is where Raffles' understanding of Malay culture, Malay history, Malay text comes into play. He basically created a Sultan of Singapore, in many respects out of thin air.
The port of Singapore is to be considered under the immediate protection.
Having installed his own sultan, Raffles organized a formal handover of power.
To be defrayed by the British government.
Hussein was to receive a handsome salary, but in return, Raffles would be able to run the island as he wanted.
This treaty is concluded at Singapore on the 8th day of February in the year of our Lord, 1819.
This historic occasion was witnessed by a few dozen sea gypsies, pirates and fishermen who lived on the island.
My great-grandfather was there. You see, maybe he must be a kid at the time. He didn't understand, but he must have remembered a few things, what he saw. That was the first time somebody saw a white man coming to Singapore. When they were just aghast, I suppose, and they didn't understand the whole thing about that.
With the signing of the treaty, Singapore's history as a Malay island had effectively come to an end.
Company, face the flag!
From now on, it was to be a British settlement in the hands of the East India Company.
Company, salute!
A blank canvas to be shaped by the vision of one man. Nearly 200 years later, a statue of Raffles stands on the spot where he came ashore. But how was this one man going to turn a swamp into a city? We live in a global economy where goods, people and ideas move freely across the planet. And Singapore, at the crossroads of great shipping lanes, is a city born of globalization. Ever since the 19th century, its fortunes have depended on the ebb and flow of international trade. Back then, the world's largest corporation was based in London. The East India Company was unlike any merchant company of old. It had its own civil service and army, and ruled over a fifth of the world's population. Its network of trade routes stretched across half the world, and in its heyday, the company generated more revenue than Britain itself. And its most valuable cargo was tea. Since the days of Marco Polo, Chinese tea had become immensely popular in Europe. Half the company's profits came from supplying this one fashionable drink.
The British had cultivated a particular liking for tea, and the market was growing all the time. The East India Company found that this was a major item for their business and kept the company going. But what could they pay for the tea with? They had relatively little to sell to China to pay for the tea. This was a problem for the company for a long time, until they eventually discovered opium. Opium was the one thing that the Chinese did not have and did want in large quantities. And once the British discovered that the Chinese needed the opium and that they had supplies of it in India, an area like here, at the foot of the Straits of Malacca, turning round into the South China Sea, became very important in their eyes.
The East India Company was producing opium in northern India and shipping it to China, where it was used to buy supplies of tea, which could then be sent back to England. It was the company's most profitable trade route, but every one of its ships had to pass through a narrow passage known as the Malacca Straits. To protect its interests, the company wanted to set up a port somewhere at the foot of the Malacca Straits. But there was a problem. For 200 years, the Dutch had controlled the East Indies. They were the military and economic superpower in the region, and it was company policy to do nothing which might upset them. Raffles' expedition to Singapore was deliberately provocative. He was an official of the company and had been told to tread very carefully. No one expected him to set up a port under the very noses of the Dutch.
Company, salute!
Whenever he talked about furthering British ambitions east of Calcutta, everyone said, "Oh, let's leave it as it is. Don't rock the boat. You know, the Dutch aren't going to like it." And Raffles thought, "Well, to hell with the Dutch. I like it, and I'm going to do it." And he did.
2 weeks after Raffles raised the British flag over Singapore, news reached his boss, Charles Bannerman, the governor of Penang. Bannerman didn't like or trust the ambitious young Raffles and was furious that one of his men had breached company policy. He urgently contacted his Dutch counterparts to assure them that Raffles had been acting on his own initiative, without the authority of the company.
He was very effusive and said, "Very sorry, we'll call the man back. He was quite out of order, and I'm sure you needn't worry about him being there for very long."
Bannerman's assurances stopped the Dutch from invading Singapore. They simply waited for the British to pull out. But Bannerman hadn't accounted for the mood back in London. The recent Napoleonic Wars had seen an upsurge in military pride and a greater sense of national defiance. Rather than giving in to the Dutch over Singapore, word was sent to Bannerman that Raffles should be allowed to stay put.
There was great brouhaha back in Europe. In the end, the dust died down, and after a few years, it was a fait accompli. The Dutch weren't going to do anything about it.
Raffles realized that for Singapore to survive, it needed to be more than a stopover between India and China, and become a port in its own right, attracting trade from across the region. But how could he persuade traders to come to his new settlement?
This whole region was full of traders all over the place. There are many river mouths, small ports. So what Raffles did was to provide them with a place where they could come and trade freely. By providing that service, the word got around very, very quickly, and all these people realized that this was a tremendous advantage. If they brought all their trade to Singapore, they could bring in all kinds of goods, sell almost anything they could get without having to pay taxes. And there was just nothing like that anywhere else in Asia.
This was Raffles' big idea, free trade. It was the bait that would lure traders away from other ports in the region and make Singapore their base.
Raffles realized Singapore could become the center of a regional trade and tap into the vast production base of the East Indies. The bird's nest from Borneo, and camphor, and resins from the jungle which were used for lacquer, very important for China, of course, gold dust from Bali, and then of course there's the main thoroughfare, the east-west trade route between China and India. One contemporary description of the place said that the ships were coming to Singapore like bees clustering round a honeypot. The place was literally swarming with trade.
Raffles was delighted by the success of his new trading post. He called it his little child. But he was to be an absent father. He was immediately summoned back to Bencoolen, a remote British base in southern Sumatra. His official job was as governor here, and the company insisted he return to his duties. He would be away from his little child for the next 3.5 years. In that time, people flocked to Singapore, and their descendants still populate the island today. A large Chinese community had already been living and trading along the Malacca Straits for centuries. Many simply moved to Singapore to enjoy the benefits of free trade. Others came direct from mainland China to escape the hardships of Manchu rule. Indians also came as traders, but more often they were soldiers and civil servants already well versed in the ways of the British Empire. Today, the Indian community still preserves ancient traditions from the homeland, traditions which have disappeared in India itself. And Singapore's other great community, then and now, were the Malays. A few, like Othman Wok's great-grandfather, were sea gypsies already living on the island. But the vast majority came from elsewhere across the Malay archipelago. They came to make money, but also to worship freely. From the very beginning, religious tolerance was part of the ethos of multi-ethnic Singapore. This is the oldest surviving sketch of the emerging settlement, drawn by one of the British officers. Within just 4 years, 10,000 people had set up home here. Raffles had left his old friend William Farquhar in charge. He had lived in the region for many years and had a very relaxed attitude to what he called local customs. Slave trading was allowed. Gambling was commonplace. Even cockfighting, which Raffles despised. Farquhar also did nothing to stop the spread of opium. This drug the British had promoted within China was fast becoming an addiction among Chinese workers in Singapore.
People were free to come here looking for a fortune, but the, we'll say, application of the law might have been a bit lax. There was this sense of an open port where anything could happen.
According to accounts of the time, there were robberies and stabbings every day. There was a tiny police force, but the policemen were often the first to be murdered.
When Raffles returns in 1822, he's just aghast. It hasn't quite got the feel of this English colonial trade port that he imagined. And he basically fires Farquhar.
I can't believe what you've done! What kind of place are you running here? Slaves, cockfighting, opium dens?
Raffles blamed Farquhar for allowing the settlement to lose its way.
I don't care how they live. We have a responsibility.
He expected higher standards for his little child.
And you're not setting a very good example.
Raffles perceived it as being chaotic. He wants it to create ideas of science and the arts and literature that were being promoted by the Enlightenment in the late 18th century.
The Enlightenment in Europe was an age of reason, order, and progress. And Raffles hoped to bring these lofty ideals to Singapore. While the town was still in its infancy, he drew up an elaborate blueprint for its future, laying out a modern grid structure of roads, dividing up the population into different ethnic areas. Everything was designed to be as rational and efficient as possible.
He left specific instructions for the style of architecture. The famous Singapore 5-foot way, which was a sort of continuous arcade on either side of the street, which would protect you from the sun and also from the rain. And the facades of the building were to have a uniform appearance. So he thought about all these little details.
In Raffles' vision, the river would be the central artery of the town, along which trade could flow. He created a wharf, Boat Quay, to be a focal point for mercantile establishments. Today, the Singapore River is quiet, to be enjoyed by pleasure boats. But throughout the 19th century, cargo from around the world traveled along the river and filled the warehouses of Boat Quay, just as Raffles had predicted.
The smell, the sounds, the atmosphere, the environment would have been very different. Moored alongside the banks would have been tongkangs, sampans, lightermen, and they would have blocked up this entire river with barely enough room for any big craft to move in. And people would be moving sacks of rice, of goods from the warehouses, from the go-downs, and that would have been a scene that you would have seen in the late 19th century, early 20th century Singapore. This was the place where commerce started in Singapore. This was the cradle of commerce.
Today, the warehouses of Boat Quay have been closed down and relocated to the modern port. But Raffles' other creation is very much alive. Behind the quayside, he designated a swampy, uninhabited area to become the commercial center of town. The skyscrapers of the modern business district sit on exactly the same spot today. Raffles believed that free trade had a magical quality that could transform Singapore, and this skyline is testament to that belief. The central square in the business district still has the same shape and dimensions as when it was first designed. Only now it is known as Raffles Place, in honor of its founder.
Shortly before he left Singapore for the last time, he wrote to a correspondent in England, and he said something like, "I've had to mould everything from first to last, to introduce a system of energy, purity and encouragement that will last for a century or two." That's Raffles thinking 200 years ahead.
In June 1823, Raffles returned to England, suffering from a suspected brain tumor. He had spent just 9 months in total in Singapore. During that time, he had turned it from an obscure, irrelevant island into a bustling port and committed it to a future of free trade. But was free trade really as magical as Raffles believed? Could it alone conjure up the city of his dreams? Singapore is a city built for the purpose of free trade. The idea that anyone can buy and sell whatever they like without interference from government has been at the cornerstone of Singapore's success since it was first introduced in the 19th century. By the 1850s, the island had already enjoyed 3 decades of free-flowing trade. There was an international community of wealthy traders and merchants. Few were wealthier than Hu Ah-kay, better known as Whampoa. He could buy and sell almost anything that was needed on the island, and was extremely popular. The British called him the best Chinaman who ever lived.
The kind of people who were getting really rich were the local traders. There were Chinese and there were Arabs and there were Indians who were operating at what in today's terms we would call small and medium enterprises who could build up. They were not capital intensive anyway. It was quite easy for them to make money. They're not paying taxes. You're not charging them anything for the use of the services made available to them. Of course they made money. For the company, it's quite a different matter.
The East India Company, which ran Singapore, was in financial trouble. Its lucrative Chinese tea trade had collapsed as people in Britain preferred Indian tea, which could be drunk with milk. The company was still obliged to govern the settlement, but it did so very reluctantly.
By the 1850s, the company saw Singapore as a complete burden. It wasn't bringing any profit or interest to the company whatsoever. The private merchants were making a great deal of money. But none of this is getting into the government coffers. There is no money to pay for a good police force, for instance. There's no money to pay for port improvements. But the community wants all of these. They want all of them, but there's no money to pay for them.
Ironically, free trade, which had made Singapore wealthy, generated very little revenue for the running of the island. Since Raffles' time, the flow of goods had never been taxed. The policy had become an article of faith among Singapore's merchants and traders.
There was no import taxes. There was no income tax. There was no company tax. And we human beings had not developed at that point of time the GST, the value added tax. Then where do you get the money to finance your state expenditure?
The company came up with an unusual plan to raise revenue by encouraging vice. The right to supply opium was licensed and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Whoever won the license was then free to sell as much of the drug as they liked, without any restrictions. But the more opium they sold, the more they needed to keep selling, because the company kept pushing up the cost of the license. It was a vicious circle. The company also took a slice of the profits from prostitution. There were 15 men for every 1 woman in Chinatown. Girls were shipped in from Japan to serve as prostitutes.
Chinatown in the mid-19th century was rampant with vice. Behind the windows of the shop houses were opium dens and brothels. The British tolerated these squalid establishments because they generated revenue, which enabled the company to govern Singapore.
But raising money from vice only stored up problems for the company. The opium dens and brothels were run by secret societies, powerful clan-based organizations with complex roots in mainland China.
These secret societies had a grip on the people who were members of the organization. And these were coolies, rickshaw drivers, shopkeepers, and even traders. Now, the British didn't really understand how they operated because they appeared to the British to be very mysterious criminal organizations because of their elaborate rituals of membership. They also threatened law and order in Singapore because of fights between rival gangs and secret societies.
Each secret society demanded the complete loyalty of its members. They were expected to defend the honor of their clan against anyone who interfered with their lucrative business.
We
want to thank you for all of your cooperation.
The company officials sought the help of prominent local Chinese businessmen such as Wampo to control these organizations. But little did they know that these Chinese businessmen themselves were often involved in the running of these organizations. So without knowing it, they had actually tolerated and created a connection between opium, crime, and the Chinese community. And when they knew it, it was too late for them to do anything about it.
The city was developing a reputation for sleaze and vice. It was known locally as Sin Galore, and the company had neither the will nor the way to improve things. When change finally came, it was prompted once more by events thousands of miles away, in Egypt. The Suez Canal was opened in 1869. At a stroke, it transformed the way goods were moved around the world. Before then, ships from Europe would sail around the Cape of Good Hope to reach the Far East. Now they could come directly, through the Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean, then down the Malacca Straits and past Singapore. The canal cut 5,000 miles off the journey and brought a 50% increase in trade in the first 5 years.
Once the Suez Canal was being used as the normal means of getting through Asia, Singapore had a completely fresh start. It was now seen and recognized, not simply as just a route to China alone, but simply as the port for anybody who's trading in this whole region. And this became increasingly the role of Singapore.
In modern economic jargon, Singapore had become the hub of Southeast Asia, the first port of call for Western ships wanting to operate in the region.
If a ship were to come from London and distribute various products, it would be much more economical if you come to a center. And from that center, it will be broken up into smaller parcels and distribute to different parts of Southeast Asia. That is the concept of a hub. As the region gets richer and richer, Singapore was trading with more and more countries, and up to today, Singapore is the 16th biggest trading country in the world. 16th, which is not too bad for a small place.
Singapore's fortunes received a further boost from another part of the world. In 1877, 6 small trees were smuggled out of Brazil and sent to the botanical gardens in Singapore. The director of the gardens was a Scottish botanist, Henry Ridley. He realized they were rubber trees and well suited to the climate of Southeast Asia.
Ridley started to tell all the planters, local and British, you plant rubber. The story went that whenever he went to a function, he would take some rubber seeds and put into their pockets. Later on, some people thought he went a bit cuckoo. They call him mad Ridley. But actually, he was not mad. And I think history proved that he was right. No use just have the plants, but how do you tap the latex? So he devised a system of tapping. You only cut some parts of it in a V shape so that the rubber latex could dip into a cup and you can collect from the cup. At that time it was white gold. The black gold today will be oil. But at that time in Southeast Asia, that was gold. It brought in tons and tons of money.
There was not enough land in Singapore to meet the global demand for rubber. So in the decades that followed, businessmen from Singapore opened up huge rubber estates in neighboring Malaya. And every tree was cut using the method devised by Henry Ridley. At the same time, there was a boom in Malayan tin mining because of the popularity around the world for canned food. And the port of Singapore, at the foot of the Malayan Peninsula, was ideally located for exporting tin and rubber to the factories of Europe and America.
Well, once the rubber and tin industries developed in Malaya, Singapore became a very important port through which these two commodities were shipped out. So they were sent down to Singapore, processed in Singapore, and then distributed to the rest of the world. And what this did was to make Malaya, the peninsula to the north of Singapore, the natural and economic hinterland of Singapore. And they both became an integrated economic unit.
It was increasingly obvious to the British that Singapore was too important a link in its trading empire to be left to the whims of the East India Company. The island was turned into a crown colony to be subsidized by the British government from London. And after years of neglect, it was given a facelift, befitting an important colony. New roads were built, new public buildings, a police station, law courts.
There was a reason for investing in good government in order to keep up the British name of providing a good legal system and the kind of prosperity that would attract more traders and more people would come and invest there and use Singapore as a base for further trade. All these things, I think one thing leads up to another. And by providing good government, everybody would make more money.
Singapore was no longer run by company employees, but professional civil servants, imbued with a Victorian sense of morality their predecessors never had. For the first time, British officials learned to read and speak in Chinese. After half a century running the island, they could at last communicate with the people they were governing.
And the new governors were not just businessmen anymore. They were graduates of Oxford and Cambridge. They were people with a mission. It was an imperial mission in which the best of British civilization, so to speak, would be offered to these people who have so much to learn.
From the late 1870s, there was a concerted effort to clean up the squalid image of sin galore. Opium was officially discouraged, prostitution was regulated, and secret societies were banned. Chinese businessmen like Whampoa had to disavow their links with the criminal underworld and became part of the British establishment. Singapore would never again be the wild eastern town of its early years. And its traders would never rule the roost as they once did. Today, Singapore's latest tourist attraction, the reverse bungee, sits on the very spot where Whampoa's riverside warehouse used to be. In 1887, to celebrate Queen Victoria's Jubilee, a statue was built honouring the city's founder, Sir Stamford Raffles. In the same year, the world-famous hotel that bears his name was also opened, the epitome of colonial sophistication in the East. By this time, Raffles had been dead for 60 years, but his little child had finally come of age.
If he had been there to witness the unveiling of his own statue, I think he would have been largely very pleased with what he saw. The prosperity of the place and the fact that it was this great hub of trade, the general freedom that people had to live as they liked, that would have pleased him too.
This is some of the oldest surviving cinefilm of Singapore, shot at the beginning of the 20th century. It shows a cosmopolitan city alive with the energy and enterprise of its people. It's also an orderly, efficient city, as Raffles had hoped it would be. But how much of Raffles' vision is still alive today? Modern Singapore is a 21st century Asian metropolis, a world away from the coolies and bumboats of old. What are today's Singaporeans to make of their colonial past? Singapore of old was the creation of Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles. But the modern city-state has been the work of another man, Lee Kuan Yew. In 1959, he took control of Singapore, leading it out of the British Empire and towards independence. But how would Lee's Singapore deal with the legacy of its colonial past? One of the first decisions the independent government made was that the statue of Raffles, built for Queen Victoria's Jubilee, should remain in the centre of town. Modern Singapore would be built on the same foundations as Raffles' little child.
The legacy is that of connectedness with the world. That was what made Singapore get off the ground. From a barely inhabited island, infertile, of no consequence to the world, he made it an important hub. And that we must keep up, because otherwise we would sink back to a fishing village.
Raffles left behind the importance of free trade. That principle has been upheld by the British government, by the independent Singapore government throughout. That was never touched.
Raffles' presence is still felt in modern Singapore. Across the street from the old black Victorian statue, a new white replica now stands.
It's refreshing in some ways in this anti-colonial age that you get the not only the acceptance of this figure, but almost a glorification. Singaporeans often seem to think that their founder was a lily-white god almost.
But in one fundamental way, modern Singapore is very different from the Singapore of Raffles. The flag that flies overhead is no longer the Union Jack. and its people are no longer colonial subjects.
Raffles could not imagine the British actually gone, with people who were brought here running their own show in a country, a nation state. I'm not sure that Raffles was aware of such an idea.
He never had to worry about whether the thing was a self-governing or whether there was a self to govern. The British governed it. You came, you do your business, make your money, go back if you like, stay if you like. I had to make this place work. We were Chinese from various parts of China, Indians from various parts of India, Malays from various parts of the archipelago. We had to weld ourselves into one cohesive society, so that this is not a hotel, this is a home. That's different.
The story of how Singapore made the journey from colony to nationhood is still being written. This country is only 40 years old. But at every twist and turn, the impact of Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles has been felt. He created a trading post in the jungle and gave birth to a modern city.